including an occupation outside the local police precinct. Then, activists demanded accountability for officers' violence, and not for the first time in the city's history, city leaders attempted to revise how officers' misconduct was evaluated and enacted a series of policy reforms. And yet, despite residents' outcry, in the years that followed, MPD officers' violence continued. So did the protests. As I thought about the historic importance of the protests unfolding in Minneapolis and elsewhere, I started to wonder what it would take to really change policing. Why were cities unable to staunch the horrific repetition of state violence? And who or what could really change the system? As I worked to understand these questions, I began reaching out to activists, organizers, and city leaders to better understand the politics of policing in Minneapolis. And it was actually my first student collaborator, Santino Reynolds, who understood that we couldn't understand these politics without talking to residents in Minneapolis, especially North Minneapolis, the historically segregated enclave where first Jewish residents and later Black neighbors who had found refuge after fleeing the South. And so Santino and I, together with a group of graduate students who would join the project, started doing interviews in North Minneapolis, ultimately talking to over 100 Northsiders between 2017 and 2019. And it was these resident stories that taught me the most about policing and the challenges the city would face after the murder of George Floyd. So today I was asked to start with an excerpt from the book. So what I want to do is take you in the middle of the book. So the first half of the book talks about the kind of build-up and preamble, how we got to this moment of George Floyd's murder, the Powderhorn Declaration, and this promise to end the Minneapolis Police Department. The back half of the book walks through all of the consequences of that moment as they unfolded in the city. So the excerpt that I'm going to read for you today is the end of the chapter about the interviews in North Minneapolis and the beginning of the first chapter of the second half of the book, and then we will start our conversation. Police violence in black and white. Living side by side, white residents and residents of color in Northside experience separate social realities. Across both racial groups, many of our participants were moved by BLM organizing, but in qualitatively different ways. Most Black residents described how their own negative experiences with police and collective trauma were reinforced by the repeated example of police killings and the lack of justice that followed. This cycle often resulted in what we call a realist perspective on police violence, which understood police killings as an endemic, perhaps permanent, social problem produced by racism and the persistent dehumanization of Black people. With pervasive anti-Blackness, stark residential segregation, a lack of economic and political power in Black communities, and majority white police departments, police unions, and courtrooms, residents of color questioned how much police reform, even propelled by dedicated activists and happening under the city's first Black police chief, could stop the violence. The reforms the MPD had implemented in 2015 to 2019 were too little, too late, continually invalidated by police violence across the country. As a result, residents were critical of the ability of city residents and activists and researchers to change that reality. Simultaneously, however, many of them desperately wanted more safety in Northside, even at times when that meant relying on the police force. White participants, in contrast, typically describe being newly conscious of racialized police violence. Many expressed racial sympathy towards their Black neighbors, raising issues of racial profiling, police harassment, and the threat of police violence, all victories of Black Lives Matter protests, activists, and organizations. Yet many white interviewees continued to minimize the harm of police violence as the work of, quote, a few bad apples, rather than systematic oppression. Being at arm's length from police violence also changed the tenor of the interviews, with white residents questioning the role of police as an abstract dilemma, not a direct threat to their lives and their loved ones. As a result, they more often shied away from the deeper, more transformative visions of what needed to change in policing and society. All of these themes would come to shape the city's response to the murder of George Floyd. Part 2 is titled In the Wake of Rebellion, and Chapter 4 is titled George Floyd is Still Dead. In June 2020, for a moment, anything seemed possible in Minneapolis. In the midst of a deadly global pandemic, much of the country had gone on lockdown, radically reorienting work, family, and community life. We had witnessed a horrific murder committed by a police officer, filmed by a teenager, and broadcast to the world. the largest protest in the country's recorded history erupted, spreading the Black Lives Matter rallying cry across the globe. The Minneapolis Police Department had tried to implement the police reform playbook, and yet George Floyd was still dead. The city still burned. If the department could not be reformed, then perhaps it must be reimagined. In the wake of the rebellion, 9 city council members took to the stage at Powderhorn Park, festooned with giant letters that read, "Defund Police." Standing next to activists fighting for police abolition, the elected officials pledged to begin the process of ending the Minneapolis Police Department and developing a new transformative model for cultivating safety. Media headlines across the country blared that the city was poised to end, dismantle, or abolish its police force. That process, however, would quickly become a tedious, contentious, and years-long political battle over amending the Minneapolis City Charter to change the section on the MPD, a protected department in the city's governing document. Advocates would argue for striking out all of the text on the MPD, replacing it with a description of a new department oriented around holistic public safety, which could include the police. And because of the mayor's opposition to pass this charter amendment, the council members would need support from a majority of city voters. This proposal to end the MPD faced the expected opposition, as downtown business interests sided with the mayor, police chief, and officers union in deriding the quote-unquote radical proposal. But it was not simply the mayor's bloc opposing the charter initiative. Indeed, on this particular issue, downtown business leaders, the police union, and some Black community leaders, including a few prominent radical anti-police violence activists, agreed. The charter amendment to end the MPD was a dangerous path for Minneapolis. As a Star Tribune article in July 2020 blared, egregious, grotesque, absurd, crazy, ridiculous. These are a handful of the words that some local African American leaders are using to rebuke the Minneapolis City Council's move towards dismantling the police department, even as they demand an overhaul of law enforcement. Though these groups' critiques of the proposal varied, a core through line was the idea that city council members had been led astray by abolitionist activists who did not represent the interests of many Black city residents or their ideas about safety in the city of Lakes. To understand how and why such disparate groups came to share opposition to the charter amendment, in this chapter we return to the murder of George Floyd and its aftermath, culminating in the historic election of November 2021. As we'll see, the divide across activist coalitions and between activists, city leaders, and residents witnessed in earlier years had by 2020 ruptured, producing starkly different ideas about safety. As a result, while the fires that blazed through the city reshaped Minneapolis politics, much stood unchanged in the ashes of rebellion. So with that, we will turn to a conversation.
This is my first book signing / talk, so I don't know the etiquette yet, so thank you for indulging me. Michelle, I've been looking forward to this conversation quite a bit, coming most recently from Cincinnati, Ohio, where we also were under a federal consent decree for similar actions and an unfortunate similar history in terms of state violence against largely unarmed African Americans, mostly males, mostly young, sort of left us in a place. And so the research that I participated in that was published both in the Stanford Journal and the American Psychology Association is based on a set of work that was based on community participatory research. And it was about radical imaginations around how do we begin to reclaim safety. So for these reasons, among others being an African American woman with 2 brothers and a father and uncles and nephews and even a sorority sister named Sandra Bland that lost her life in police custody. Instances of state violence and community violence are all around us. I'm sure a lot of us have stories that we could tell of either personally or our friends. So I wanted to start with positionality, and if you could just talk about a little bit of what you bring in the room when you and all the identities that you represent decided that this was the book and these were the stories that you wanted to tell.
Yeah, thank you. So, I entered this work in a couple of ways that made me an outsider. One was that I am as white as I look. I sometimes joke that perception is correct. And I entered it really as a fairly new transplant to the city too, and somebody who was coming to these questions from a very academic perspective. And so the book that I ultimately wrote wasn't a book I had ever planned to write. In fact, this project had ended in 2019, and I have versions of the academic papers from this project where I try to make the case that Minneapolis is an interesting place and an important place to study racism and policing, arguments that were hard to make in some ways in 2019 to academic audiences who didn't think much about the Midwest. And so the project really started more as a question about how do we understand who's in charge of policing, how do they understand the problems in policing, what are they going to do about it. And it sort of over time became a much more personal project and a much more personal book. And in part, as I talked about a bit a minute ago, it was because students of color kept coming to my door and saying, you're the policing scholar, what are we doing on these questions, right? How do we become part of this movement? And it was really a student-led series of collaborations. And it was only after the murder of George Floyd that I started to think, I actually need to write a book on this project, and I need to not end the project in 2019. I need to pick it back up again, and I need to move forward. But that meant, my whiteness meant that there were a lot of spaces in which my motives were sometimes questioned. There is a long mistrust of academics, particularly in poor communities of color, and for good reason. And so I wound up having to do a lot of work to build trust and rapport with folks. And that's particularly difficult because so many of these activist and community positions aren't paid or very poorly compensated, and so people are turning over really quickly. So you spend all of this effort building rapport with somebody, and then they're out of that position, or there's a new organization, right? So as I sort of set up in the start of the book, this is a story in part about how Black Americans understand policing and what that meant for Minneapolis, but it's also very much a story about white people. It is about white people who were voters and city residents. It is about white folks who were pushing forward various kinds of political and organizational responses to these questions. It is about a increasingly diverse, but initially quite white cast of city leaders who were leading this process. And these questions about how Black and white Americans were navigating these spaces, including how I was navigating it in my own roles and professional capacities and in my personal life, right? A couple of the folks here are friends of mine who, every time another instance of police violence would happen, were asking me, Michelle, how do we make sense of this and what do we do about it? And so it became a much more, it became a much more personal project by the time it became the book that it is now than it was ever expected to be.
Some of the best things kind of end up that way. They kind of iterate themselves, and it was interesting to sort of read and learn about the evolution of this project that started well before George's murder. I want to lean into the phrase of over-policed and underprotected that you talk about over and over in this book, that I think really does a really nice, succinct job of sort of surmising how many folks in the African American community experience or feel about law enforcement. And then also legal, Dr. Monica Bell's statement, legal estrangement. If you could just kind of expound a little bit on that and set the table for us as we kind of delve into chapter 3 and some of the different perspectives through the interviews you conducted.
Yeah, so sometimes you hear this phrase that poor communities of color are over-policed and under-policed. And what that phrase usually is meant to reference is that these are communities in which people face really frequent, low-level contact with police officers, right? They get stopped, they get questioned. It's not about people necessarily being arrested and incarcerated for long sentences, but this daily friction with police, this daily surveillance. And that simultaneously, those same places and communities and people are under-policed. And by under-policed, people mean that there is not an effective law enforcement response to the very high rates of intra-community victimization, right? So interpersonal violence, domestic violence, other kinds of like assault, homicide, those kinds of sort of typical violent offenses in communities. And so what a lot of folks have started to shift to is that instead of thinking about, if you think about it in the terms of over-policed and under-policed, then the answer is, okay, well, we just need the right level and a better kind of policing, right? If we could just tailor it so that there weren't so many ticky-tacky stops, right? And if police officers were more polite with the people that they interacted with, that you would then have a more just outcome, right? That you just have to sort of adjust it, and you have to respond to the high rates of homicide by flooding areas with more policing or more investigatory capacity. Why I use the phrase and why people have shifted to thinking about the concept of over-policed and under-protected is that it sets up this idea that protection isn't just about law enforcement, right? Law enforcement at best have control over a very little slice of what we think of as safety, right? And they can prevent homicides in communities, but so can a lot of community resources and community interventions. So when we think about the kinds of communities that are happy and healthy and thriving, that don't rely on police force, at least don't rely on police force to call it in, but there's often police force making sure some people are kept out of those communities. We think about those communities, it's not the police that is making those communities work really well, right? It is everything else and all of the resources they have. And so that phrase is really meant to get at what are all the ways in which we have failed these communities. And that's what Monica, Dr. Bells, she's brilliant. Folks should look at her work if they haven't already. She's at Yale Law School. And so Dr. Bell's work on legal estrangement was pushing back against a similar phrase or sort of parallel concept in criminology called legal cynicism that said, because police are ineffective in these communities, people are cynical about the police. And she says, no, it's not just about the police, and it's not cynicism. It is estrangement from the state, and it is estrangement from the state that is driven by a series of state failures, right? Not just policing, but lots of other state failures. And what all of that helps us to see is that to redress these problems, it can't just be about how do we perfect policing. It has to be about how we fix all of those other structural failures and all of those forms of exclusion and estrangement.
Thank you. I want to jump into chapter 3 while you catch your breath and wet your whistle, which does a really nice job of representing some of the research and interviews that you and your team of students and partners conducted. What struck me was just how different people experience law enforcement. Mm-hmm. Could you delve into that and just say a little bit more about those different identities, especially between white and black, but also generations and race and sexuality, and how that sort of impacted their reflections on policing?
Yeah. So most of the chapter focuses on residents of color who were largely, though not exclusively, black residents. And what we heard over and over from men, women, young people, older folks, the most consistent story, it wasn't uniform, but it was consistent. The most consistent story was that black residents in North Minneapolis did feel this bind, right, of over-policing and under-protection. They felt like, look, there were shots fired on my block last week, right, or somebody I know died, and it doesn't seem like the police are doing anything to solve that. And yet at the same time, I was doing, nothing wrong, I was minding my own business, and I was stopped by the cops, right? Or I needed help from the police, and I reached out to the police, and they scorned me and didn't help me in that instance, right? And that bind was particularly acute for young men of color who were facing the most pervasive sense of stops and were the most acutely aware of it in their day-to-day life, right? Like if I'm riding in a car with a bunch of my friends, that's gonna look suspicious to the police. But it wasn't just the young men. And in fact, one of the things we unpack in that chapter, and I should note the chapter is co-authored with my student Amber Joy Powell, who is a professor at Iowa now, and Chris Robertson, who couldn't be here tonight because he has a 1-month-old baby at home. But what we found was that for women in particular, there was this sort of, not only were they experiencing police stops and harassment and a lack of protection, but they were also experiencing exposure to gender-based violence inside and outside the home. And they were especially worried about calling the police because of the criminalization of their partners, their husbands, their children. And so it was women of color who I think most acutely articulated this: we're damned if we do, damned if we don't, right? Either I call the police and maybe they show up and maybe they help, or if I don't call the police, maybe I'm better off on my own. And the back half of the chapter really thinks about contrasting those experiences with the experiences of white residents in North Minneapolis who, not exclusively, but a majority of them, a slim majority of them, talked in really nuanced ways about how they were newly aware of racial disparities in policing, that they now were more thoughtful about when and how they invoked the police and what they thought might happen if they invoked the police. But they also didn't have this sense of sort of visceral urgency about the problem, right? To them, it was sort of this abstract policy dilemma. And there's this one woman we call Sheila in the book whose story kind of haunts me. I give a long quote from her, but what she essentially says is, you know, we should pursue this reform, but I don't think it'll work. And maybe we should pursue this reform, but I don't think that's gonna work either. And I guess we should pursue this reform, but I don't think that's gonna work either. In the end, it's just all really complicated. And that was kind of the sense that I got from white folks. It wasn't the same moral clarity and urgency of like, we need to do something about racism. Even if a lot of residents thought it was unlikely that that would actually be addressed, they knew that that was the answer for black residents. Whereas for white residents, it was this very abstract sense of something is wrong and bad and it's complicated, but I don't quite know what to do about it.
So you've got to read this book if you haven't now. I mean, we're just starting, and you can see there's a lot of good stuff and a lot to unpack. I kind of want to stay there with the woman that you call Sheila, and it's complicated, and you know we should try it, but it's probably not going to work. And you talk about this cycle sort of police violence, outrage, protests, and then it kind of devolves, and then it kind of starts again into this round and around we go. Can you talk about the politics of policing and why it seems so hard to just address it and get it done?
Yeah, you know, Sheila's words really haunted me because what I kept grappling with during the project and then writing the book was she right? And will people come away from my book thinking, oh, it is all just too complicated. Like, thank you for beautifully unpacking this for 300 pages. I now appreciate just how fucked we are, right? But like, what do I do with that? And we're gonna keep it real here, if that's okay. Swearing on YouTube. And, you know, I think why we see this, the argument I make in the book is that we see this repetition, this continual repeat cycle of police violence, outrage, calls to reform, a period of quiescence, and then it starts over again. In part because violence is baked into the role of policing. Like, we are never going to get to a place where policing has zero violence. Like, that is just inherent to the role. And in some cases, in fact, the public cheers that violence, right? There are moments in which that violence we would see as just or heroic. And so the challenge, I think, then, is to think about how do we get consensus as a society about what that illegitimate violence looks like, what are the bounds on it, how do we regulate it, and how do we prevent those interactions from happening in the first place. And so my answer to Sheila is that it is extremely complicated, and police reform is so hard and so often fails or backslides. But we can make meaningful investments in communities and meaningful investments just in our day-to-day lives and the people we're in community with that try to ameliorate some of those root causes. And that, like, that struggle is the work, even if it doesn't seem like it's this obvious quick fix that will break this cycle indefinitely. I think that cycle is sort of a persistent reality. And our question is, I think, at best, like, how do we get to a better point of failure next time? Because there will be a next time.
Yeah, beautifully explained, and I think makes sense and sort of mirrors the path of Black liberation more broadly in America, and how, you know, a couple steps forward, 5 steps back, and so it's a river, and it's going to take a while. I want to talk a little bit about the city being known as really for its being liberal. And it is in a lot of ways, a lot of progressive policies, a lot of things that we can kind of check the box that I think are things that policies are good for families, good for our neighbors, good for ourselves. But how do we sort of reconcile that and compare and contrast? It's haunted. Compare and contrast Minneapolis as a model for other cities that are also grappling with the same problem. How alike or dissimilar is Minneapolis, and what can the example be here for other cities that are also engaged in this work?
Yeah, thank you. So the project was actually originally called Policing the Progressive City, and it was meant to get at that exact tension, right? What is the sort of best case scenario in a city where city leaders promise to listen to Black voices and ostensibly care about things like police violence? What might those reforms look like in the Black Lives Matter era in that kind of a place? And I got lots of feedback on how people hated the title. They thought it was like wonky and academic. They thought, oh, this means the book is set in the progressive era, which was the weirdest one. But you can see how they got there. But then this other critique was, if you call it Policing the Progressive City, you are accepting the terms that we are a progressive city and we are not, right? And you don't want to sort of fall into the trap of that binary thinking. And where I sort of end up in the book is obviously in the sort of summer of 2020, it became very obvious that we shouldn't think of Minneapolis as a best case scenario around policing or police reform, maybe a best case scenario about highlighting the failures of liberal police reform. But I do think that it is a place that at least is sort of working towards some of this, and it is a place, I think, most importantly, where people are committed to a progressive vision. And so the activism, the organizations, the sort of infrastructure here to do something different is really important. And as much as Minneapolis gets rightfully trounced in the media around this liberal reputation, I will say it's because of that activism that we know when people kill people here. And in fact, Minneapolis does not stand out among similarly sized cities for its rate of police violence. And there are lots of cities, and all of the cities that, the few cities of the same size that are Republican-led, which is very rare for cities of this size. But places in red states, places led by conservatives, have higher rates. You just don't hear about the police violence in those places. And so I do sometimes think that argument of Minneapolis is not as liberal as it thinks it is absolutely not. It's also a lot more liberal than a lot of places, and we have a lot more opportunities here than I think you do have in places. I think that explicit commitment makes some difference, although part of the argument that is a little disempowering, but I think factually true in the book, is that cities just don't control a lot of the kinds of policies that create well-being, and so a lot of the investments we need are at the state and federal level. There's just only so much cities can do in that space of redistribution. But insofar as having a government that is at least explicitly committed to that helps push that forward, we are in a better spot and we have more capacity than a lot of other cities.
And I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I know that this is the part of the program where we turn to Q&A from the audience, so we want to give you a chance to engage with our author in this text. Are there any questions that anyone has that they'd like to offer? Sure. Pass the mic. Thank you.
I'm fine.
Okay.
So with Eric Adams as a recent example, why, and his handling of things in New York City with protests, why are mayors typically either captured by the police or at least afraid of them? Why isn't there any leadership from the mayors willing to take the police and the police unions on? Doesn't seem like we're seeing that anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, Eric Adams is a really interesting example. I'll answer the kind of broader question first and then come back to New York. I mean, I think on the broader question, police have become really powerful political actors in a lot of cities. And they, in some ways, we think about the power structure as one in which the mayor or City Hall in some cities, is supposed to be in charge ostensibly of the police force, and yet it often seems inverted, right? It seems like the police are in charge of the mayor. And if you look at Minneapolis's history, in fact, for many, many years, it was the case that people who wanted to be mayor would seek the endorsement of the officers' union. And that shifted in very recent years to now, you know, when we saw the Hodges versus Fry, it was this debate of like, no, you're going to carry water for the union. No, it's you, right? It's kind of back and forth. So I do think that's starting to shift a bit, but in terms of like, do mayors actually pull it together, and are they able to exert political control over the police, is a really difficult question. I think that's partly why you get cities like Minneapolis that are now under federal consent, or will soon be under federal consent decree, are under federal investigation, that requires these outside legal agents to come and sort of exert the authority. And part of the reason is that mayors rely on their police, just as every single actor in the criminal justice system relies on police as kind of the front end of the system. Mayors rely on police to maintain the sense of order in a city. And so it is extremely difficult for mayors to exert political power over the police, or to be seen as sort of publicly warring with the police chiefs that they appoint, right? And one of the issues with the union, Michael Lansing from Augsburg is in the audience and will be telling us soon much more about police unions in Minneapolis. But one of the sort of challenges is that police unions have gotten sort of more conservative often than the chiefs that are in charge of the department. So it's not just about mayors and police chiefs. It's like the mayors and police chiefs are often aligned, and it's the rank and file in the unions that they're fighting. And police are one of the few public sector unions that maintain a lot of public legitimacy and a lot of public power. So those unions are difficult to navigate around, and we've seen that in Minneapolis for sure. You know, Adams is really interesting in New York because there was this moment where it felt like New York was going to be, because of the post-George Floyd protests, New York was going to be on the cusp of this sort of progressive turnover. And instead, what do you get? You get somebody who identifies very much as law enforcement, but black law enforcement, right, with that particular credibility. I don't know how many of you remember the campaign video where he's like ransacking his teenage son's household and sort of encouraging people, but like the kind of cultural cachet of that argument, I think, shows just how internalized it is that people, even in left-leaning cities, they want this sense, right, that they have this strong mayor, this somebody who's going to maintain what they see as a vision of order. And so even in places like New York, you see former police become mayors, even in this moment of real contestation around police violence. I don't know that he will last long in that position, so it's maybe a like particular moment, but I think it again kind of highlights what happens in left-leaning cities and the kind of difficulties in really sort of sticking public attention with police violence long enough before it's inevitably distracted by concerns about community violence.
Yes, please.
I'm wondering to what extent you think the failure of the amendment to the charter to pass, well, how you see that failure, and to what extent you think it was due to a lack of an adequately developed alternative.
So I have a whole sort of half chapter that talks about the charter amendment, so I could go on for a very long time about this question, but the short version I will say is that city council members' hands were somewhat tied, in that by the time that they are moving forward with this citizen-led petition to strike out the clauses about the MPD and replace them with this Department of Public Safety, they had also been told by city leadership or city legal authorities that they couldn't actually begin the process of planning for that new department, because the process of planning for that department would constitute campaigning for it. And so that we had to wait to the vote to flesh it out. And so structurally, there was very little way for organizers behind the campaign amendment to build out what would have ultimately been the plan for it. And, you know, to the extent that it was about sort of building out new models of public safety, I think all of us can anticipate that that would have taken months and years. And in fact, the city has invested in alternative models of public safety, including unarmed behavioral crisis response teams, which I talk about in the last empirical chapter of the book. And those have taken years to sort of grow and stand up. And so I think the charter amendment, the question always was not would the city be able to stand up these alternative models of responding and preventing 911 calls, but what would they do in the meantime with a police force where the rank and file and the chief, although he soon thereafter retired, were explicitly opposed to the idea, right? We're writing op-eds in the case of the chief saying that the position would be wholly unbearable. So I don't think the failure is on organizers for not having been able to map out all of that, but I do think voters were put in this predicament of voting for this thing that there was no way of knowing exactly kind of what would come next, and particularly for people who were in North Minneapolis and facing, at the time, extremely high homicide rates and just massive increases in victimization, particularly homicide. I think they were rightfully worried about if our police force, which is already much smaller than it was before, despite the fact that we're being more victimized than ever before, if our police force, they suddenly all quit in protest of this or stopped showing up, which they're already doing, right? We're already seeing these claims of blue flu. Like, what will that look like for us, right? And what I heard from community members was this sense of like, why is it that progressive change has to come on our backs? And so in the end, if you look at like the precinct voting patterns, on average folks in North Minneapolis, where, to be clear, turnout rates were pretty low, and there are diverse residents there, but overall North Minneapolis said no on the charter amendment. It was most popular in places with younger voters and the neighborhoods around George Floyd Square. And in fact, opposition to the charter amendment was the highest in the wealthiest corner of South Minneapolis, near where we sit today, right? And so I think the narrative got spun that like the charter amendment failed because Black residents didn't want it, and I think there is some complicated pieces of truth there. It wasn't that people were in support of the MPD, but it was rather that there was a lot of fear about what would happen in the charter amendment. And I think it's also true that the whitest and wealthiest neighborhoods played a large role in shutting down the amendment because they felt like it threatened their sense of safety in the city. It's also true that lots of white folks across the city voted in support of it. So, you know, I think it's kind of funny because you can find the like hot takes on the charter amendment that are like, you know, the charter amendment was only supported by white people, or like, you know, the charter amendment was shut down by this group or that group. And the reality is those demographic divides were really murky and complicated, and the clearest demographic divide wasn't about race, it was actually about age. It was the young voters who were most supportive, and it was the older voters who were most opposed to it.
Thank you.
That's fascinating. Yes, please.
Yeah, what were your thoughts on some of the like violence interrupter groups, you know, Agape or Mother's Love, whatever it may be? Is that just a rebranding of policing, or do you think that serves a different purpose in this alternative model?
So chapter 6 is for you. It starts, we were talking yesterday and I was asking Cinnamon sort of what section of the book should I read, and I said, I want a chapter opener that has a good self-contained story, and chapter 6 has a beautiful self-contained story, but it's all about the abolitionist critique of violence interrupters, and I thought, I can't like dive right into the end. Like people can only read that chapter because they've built up the trust with me reading the rest of the book. Like I can't just dive in there for a reading. But yes, there is this critique. So before we even get to the 2021 November election, there is this emerging abolitionist critique of violence interruption programs as essentially cops in t-shirts. And that's particularly pronounced because the police start sending in violence interrupters to essentially police protests and police protest sites. And so that creates this conflict between the activists and organizers and the violence interruption groups. That chapter is not just about violence interrupters, it's also about the behavioral crisis response, the BCR. I also look at REP, which is an abolitionist, they run an alternative emergency response line and a series of sort of community solidarity building initiatives. And what I sort of argue in the chapter, on violence interrupters in particular, The story is that those groups are very complicated. Some of them, their politics are very not uniform. You have some of those groups that very much see themselves as like an abolition alternative to police. You have others who very much see themselves as a complement and sometimes are very aligned with law enforcement. And where I come to in the end of the chapter is that those initiatives are already struggling, that they are attacked by both the left and the right, and they are poorly coordinated and poorly funded and asked to do heroic things. But that on net, right, attempts to try and think about how do we replace formal state security presence of people who are trained to use lethal force with other kinds of people, including people who have deep ties to the community, that for me will always be a move in a good direction, even if it's really messy and complicated. So even if they are cops in t-shirts, they're at least in t-shirts, right? And not given all of the weaponry and lethal training of police. And I think the fact that there were these conflicts between activists and violence interrupters is part of what's so difficult about doing this work, right? Like you have to really get in the nitty gritty of what does it mean to live in the world we live in, which is a starkly unequal world with disproportionate and way too high rates of exposure to violence in some communities that persists even though we're in a historic period of low crime, or at least were and still are to some extent, but much lower than it was in the 90s in places that aren't Minneapolis and weren't 2022. And so how do we, in the here and now, how do we make pragmatic but transformative change, right? And that for me is sort of where the book ends, is like how do we not get hung up on like, is this exactly my political vision and does it match it, but does this create movement towards the kind of future world that we want to see, and what can we get consensus on, given that this is such a divisive and complicated issue?
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
I'm thinking about that like idea that let's just make progress towards something different, and how the people at the city who created the behavioral crisis response, like Brian Smith and Gino Beery, they don't work at the city anymore. In fact, they have settlements with the city that, they had a terrible experience through 2020 creating that police alternative while the city was in flames, and not feeling supported by the mayor and the city administration as they're creating this like pathway that's a police alternative. And how it's very odd now, because now the mayor and my city council member will hold that up like, we have this and it's really great, but every step of the way was like, we don't want this, we don't want you, we think this is a terrible idea, until it's like a shiny thing that people are holding up as a good example. So I'm wondering, like, for the people at the city who work there, for people who are trying to create alternatives, it seems like they still are not given the kind of the accolades and the resources to fully build out those visions. That it's still like, I don't know, a huge challenge.
Yeah, co-sign all of that. Some of those folks are at BCR now, which is interesting too, because they're a contracted service. They're not part of city government, but they're a city contract. They're run independently, and so some of the folks running that program now are folks who elected not to stay at City Hall. I would say nobody should hold up Minneapolis as an example of like a functional city system that has like solved these problems. But I don't know that there is any other city that has. And I think that gets back to this question of like the alignment between mayors and police chiefs. I think all of these new public safety models, they're so fragile. Like to hold the consensus required to move those forward and to have them show initial signs of success when they operate on such teeny tiny budgets compared to everything else that the city does. I mean, the BCR had moved into new offices, and we had a new commissioner of the new department they created, and the BCR last summer couldn't get a meeting with that commissioner and didn't know whether their contract was going to expire in a couple months, and had to essentially like shame the city and the press in order to get that contract expanded. So where I end the chapter is essentially all of these initiatives are so fragile and could disappear in a minute. And we are one step away every day from police killing somebody else, or from one of these alternative public safety workers being killed on the job. And that kind of, in some ways unpredictable, but also perfectly predictable, in that at some point it will happen. There are going to be these shocks to this system, and it's going to be really hard to kind of rally the political support. And in fact, even violence interruption, there was just a city council meeting maybe 2 weeks ago now, where city council members essentially said to the new department head, we don't even know what the city's doing. Like, how many groups do we have? What are they, like, what is our strategy? And the answer was, I don't really know yet, we're working on it. So all of these are underfunded, they're under-resourced. People are churning in and out of them at really high rates, particularly staff of color. And all of them are really vulnerable because they're new, because they're pilots, because they don't have that entrenched kind of default support and scale that something like the police department has. It's easy to see any of them kind of folding. The city is certainly pushing its way towards institutionalizing some of that, but slowly, 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, and with a lot of messiness in the process. That's the optimistic chapter.
Yay. So we are at 8 o'clock, and that is our time, but there is so much more for you to engage and to learn in this book. I hope that you've purchased your copy, purchased a copy for a friend, and that you'll join us in just the other part, just straight down this hallway to the left, where Michelle will be here to sign your copy of Minneapolis Reckoning. So thank you, Michelle, for this wonderful contribution to just a reflection back on what's happened, and hopefully it's illuminating to help us figure out where we need to go to continue to move towards that radical imagination of a more fair and just future. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for hosting us, and good night.
And thank you, Cinnamon.
No, you were terrific. Oh, yeah. Yeah, girl.
I'm Sarah. My girl went to preschool at Gabriel. This is my sister Mira. Sister-in-law.
So that makes us that mysterious word doesn't make sense.
Yeah. Baseball said it absolutely nothing.
Oh, look at
Oh. Longer than an hour, otherwise I wouldn't have had such a long.
I remember
I'm just gonna just start doing
so engrossed because I already
Just like the slides.
which is pretty great.
Those are pictures.
I've been friends reading.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. So
I did one too when my friend in her book club for the more that I'm in. It was in conversation with me.
What?
yeah.
I don't want to go to that one.
And I'm like, hey, why weren't you there? It's 2019.
Yeah. My first wife had a blog called Cinnamon.
Maybe I was.
They asked you to smell it.
Did I tell my
Yeah.
Yeah. As a cinnamon, let me tell you.
Yeah.
In general.
But it was really fun. It was like,
Thank you so much for joining us.
I was on the fly.
And I've got like, if you only knew what this is how much.
Where did you train jiu-jitsu?
Oh,
in theory, yeah. Good. Hey, Dinah. Lion. Yeah.
They can spar.
Train. They can train.
I'm just reminded of the
And this was
here's the
Yeah.
I think we have the great thing.
Yeah, Jenna can't stand
Go up to the front.
when she sees, she doesn't go to any
Of any
training.
city that I know of, I think we
Not like to go to the training.
I mean at the ground
You
level.
can see that. It's kind of
Not
Yeah.
leadership, but at the ground level to like
It's like there's my child.
It's like a
if there's any city that can do it, I think we should be able to do it. We may not be able to, but I think that city just seeing the organization of the groups that are in this city.
We have a box of
And hey, how's it going?
This is my sister here and my sister-in-law Sarah.
Hi. Was it even in her backyard? Yeah, there you go. So am I.
Have you guys met Chuck Turkey?
No.
Chuck is
Hi, so nice to meet you, Eliana.
Chuck has
I'm
been
Sarah.
in the reform and the
Nice to meet you.
government watch business, I guess, for decades now. And
Yeah, maybe that's why your name
I
sounds
follow
familiar.
one issue from the city,
What is it?
civilian oversight. It's the only thing
Ah,
you were on the
I don't know.
but you're
Story too.
yeah. Go way back.
And who was your council member that you referred to?
Lene.
Oh, you're from the same way.
Yeah. Who's your council member?
Osmond.
Ah, Osmond. Who was before?
Well, Warsami was, but